Do you know the crucial differences between the transatlantic and African slave trades? The period of slavery was a grim and complex chapter in human history that had profound impacts on societies globally. However, not all forms of slavery were the same. We've put in hours of academic research to uncover the key differences between the transatlantic and African slave trades. Thanks to the work of historians and academics, we're looking into the worlds of the transatlantic slave trade and the African slave trade. While they were both intertwined by the theme of bondage, they operated under vastly different circumstances and ideologies. So, what truly set these two systems apart? What were the unique characteristics of the transatlantic slave trade compared to Africa's internal slave trade? What role did African kingdoms play in both the internal and transatlantic slave trades? And what happened to the millions of people enslaved within Africa who weren't sent across the ocean? To understand the crucial differences, we need to look back at African societies pre-colonialism. Slavery has been a long-standing aspect of human history, and Africa was no exception. Even before the intrusion of foreign powers, slavery was deeply ingrained in the social and economic structures of many African societies. The African slave trade involved the internal exchange of enslaved individuals within the continent, where people were bought and sold between African kingdoms and communities. This trade spanned various regions, including West Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa, and has a history that stretches back to ancient times. Beginning around the 8th century, extensive trade networks emerged across the Sahara Desert, linking sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean. Camel caravans were essential in this trade, transporting goods such as gold, ivory, spices across the Sahara Desert. Cities in North Africa like Cairo, Tunis, and Marrakesh evolved into significant trade hubs, with the demand for slaves driving the growth of the slave trade within Africa. The Ghana Empire was among the earliest African kingdoms to participate in the trans-Saharan slave trade. They exchanged gold, salt, and slaves with traders from North Africa. In Central Africa, the Kanem-Bornu Empire, situated near Lake Chad, also participated significantly in the slave trade, trading enslaved individuals with North African communities. The African slave trade continued for centuries until the arrival of the European powers in the 15th century changed everything. This event marked the start of the transatlantic slave trade. This was a tragic period in history where millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and brought to the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade operated through a triangular trade network, which was named after the three-legged route that defined the trade network. The first leg involved European nations, particularly Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, sending manufactured goods such as guns, cloth, iron, and beads to Africa. These goods were exchanged for enslaved individuals through arrangements with African rulers and traders who controlled the coastal regions. The second leg of the journey, known as the Middle Passage, transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to various regions in the Americas, including North America, South America, and the Caribbean. This passage was notorious for its brutality, as men, women, and children were packed into the holds of slave ships under inhumane conditions. Many captives died due to disease, malnutrition, and abuse during the harrowing months-long journey. On the final leg, ships returned to Europe carrying goods produced on plantations by enslaved laborers, such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum. These commodities fueled the economies of European countries and perpetuated the cycle of trade and exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade spanned approximately 400 years, from the 16th to the 19th century. It is estimated that over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas during this period. Those who survived faced a lifetime of forced work and mistreatment, which significantly changed the demographic and cultural landscapes of the New World. While there are many similarities between the African slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, they are yet two distinct chapters in the broader narrative of human enslavement. In the transatlantic slave trade, individuals were primarily enslaved based on racial criteria. Africans were targeted and deemed inferior due to a pervasive belief in their racial inferiority by European slave traders. This belief justified violent raids on African communities, often executed with the collaboration of local African leaders, to capture and enslave individuals. Once captured, these individuals were stripped of their cultural identities, forced to abandon their original names, languages, and religions, and coerced into adopting new identities imposed by their enslavers. In contrast, the African slave trade employed different criteria for enslavement, varying significantly across regions and societies. People could be enslaved as a consequence of debt, punishment for crimes, capture during warfare, or even through inheritance. Enslaved individuals often retained aspects of their cultural identities and could be integrated into the social fabric of their captors' communities. Also, the scale of work done by slaves in the two slave trades was far from comparable. The transatlantic slave trade was primarily driven by the insatiable demand for labor in the plantation and mining economies of the Americas. The economies of European colonial powers were heavily dependent on the exploitation of enslaved African labor to maintain these industries, which left African slaves enduring brutal working conditions. In plantations, particularly in the Americas, slaves were forced to work long hours under harsh conditions, often performing grueling labor in fields, mines, or on construction projects. On the other hand, African slavery was often economically motivated by smaller-scale domestic needs. Enslaved individuals might be employed in domestic servitude, integrated into local economies, or used in military service. Unlike the large-scale agricultural production that characterized the transatlantic system, African slavery often involved more localized and diverse economic activities that did not rely on extensive plantation labor. The transatlantic slave trade also resulted in one of the most significant forced migrations in human history. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, profoundly altering the demographic composition of both continents. This mass displacement had devastating effects on African societies, leading to the loss of a significant portion of the population and disrupting the traditional social structures. Meanwhile, African slavery was more localized and did not involve such vast population transfers. The trade affected specific regions and communities within Africa, often integrating enslaved individuals into local societies rather than uprooting them on a continental scale. While African slavery disrupted communities, its impact was more contained geographically compared to the transatlantic system. In the Americas, enslaved Africans were forced to adapt to entirely new environments, leading to the creation of hybrid cultures that blended African and European elements. They had to navigate new languages, religions, and social structures, often forming distinct cultural identities in the face of oppression. Also, slavery in the Americas was a lifelong condition. People were born into it and died as slaves, with newborn children immediately considered property and treated as slaves. In contrast, slavery in African societies was often not a permanent condition. Once a debt was repaid or a punishment served, enslaved people could regain their freedom. Even during their enslavement, individuals in some African societies retained certain freedoms. They could have wives and children who were not slaves, and in some cases, they could even hold political positions, making their experience starkly different from the absolute bondage faced by enslaved Africans in the Americas. Moreover, African slavery allowed for greater cultural continuity. Enslaved individuals were more likely to remain within their cultural and linguistic groups, although they still faced significant disruptions. The preservation of cultural identity was far more feasible within African societies, allowing enslaved individuals to maintain ties to their heritage despite their bondage. As enslaved Africans struggled against oppression in foreign lands, resistance soon began to form. Many enslaved Africans risked their lives to flee to freedom, leading to the formation of autonomous settlements of escaped slaves that were often established in remote areas. In the United States, the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and North Carolina was one such place that became a refuge for escaped slaves. In Africa, enslaved individuals frequently attempted to rebel on slave ships, fighting against their captors in hopes of regaining freedom before reaching the Americas. On the African mainland, some individuals managed to escape captivity and evade capture, finding safety in hidden communities or seeking protection from sympathetic local rulers. The late 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of the abolitionist movement, an international effort to end the slave trade and slavery itself. One of the most significant milestones in the movement was the passage of the Slave Trade Act by the British Parliament in 1807, which made the slave trade illegal within the British Empire. This landmark legislation set a precedent, leading to similar laws being enacted in other European countries. However, while the legal framework to end the slave trade was established, the fight for emancipation continued, as slavery persisted in various regions well into the 19th century. Meanwhile, in Africa, the abolition of the slave trade varied widely across different regions. The process of abolition was frequently gradual, with many regions undergoing a complex transition as societies grappled with the legacies of slavery and worked towards more equitable social structures. Today, the legacy of slavery continues to shape our world as the fight for racial equality and social justice persists. The struggle against systemic racism and the pursuit of true liberation from the historical injustices of the slave trade still continues. So, what are your thoughts on this crucial topic? Do you think either form of slavery differed in their treatment of enslaved people? To learn more about the profound impact of slavery and colonialism on African societies, we have a playlist right here for you. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.